Matt, thanks so much for being here with us. We're really excited to have you on this episode of Building Value in Innovation Ecosystems by One Valley. Why don't you just start with telling us a little bit about yourself, your story, how you started USA Launching Pad?
Thank you, Saba. Great to be here. Appreciate the opportunity to talk. I've spent the last 25 years building and scaling sales and marketing teams and their peripheral support organizations for what I describe as disruptive tech companies. Obviously, that definition's changed over time. What was disruptive 25 years ago is not necessarily so much today, but the foundational concepts in how to build and grow a disruptive company in a fast changing marketplace and both growing them internationally as well as domestically has been what I've learned to do. I actually met my co-founder at USA Launching Pad in business school. We were in the same study group. He was the only international student that was in our study group. And Gert was building incubators and accelerators in Europe, and he was recruited to come back to the States, to Silicon Valley, to build a smart cities incubator, which was a collaboration between UC Berkeley, McKinsey, and the city of San Francisco. And as he was doing that, he started getting a lot of outreach from companies that he helped in Europe in the incubators and accelerators that he had built. And all of them were having the same problem. And that problem was scaling in the US, right? They had gone through several salespeople that didn't really pan out. They recognized that they had a good product and it was working in Europe and really couldn't figure out why it wasn't translating to the US. And so Gert, knowing my background, reached out to me and we developed what was then the foundational programs of USA Launching Pad. And that's how USA Launching Pad came to be.
That's really exciting. I myself am in business school right now, and it really is so fun to be in study groups with these intelligent and extremely talented and bright people, and to see that you were able to make that connection and take it forward is really inspiring. So you in your career you've personally guided lots of these foreign companies into the US market. What has surprised you most about how these companies approach US expansion? And what's the most critical mindset shift that they must make?
I think one of the most interesting things that I've noticed is many foreign companies really assume the US is one market, right? And that's startups and even enterprises looking to expand. When really, it's a federation of micro markets, right? Regional, cultural, even industrial concentrations, right? And they often underestimate the need for specificity, right? And they go into the market using the same tactics, messaging approaches that they use in their home market that they do for the US. And oftentimes they fall flat. What works in Zurich and Singapore and London doesn't necessarily work in New York or Houston. And so really understanding that while it is one country, it is not necessarily one homogeneous market, and you need to understand that. And so, one of the mind shifts that these companies, I think, need to make is that, US entry isn't really about scaling up. It's almost launching a new company, right? So they should be thinking and treating the expansion as day one, not necessarily year five or wherever they are in their journey.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So, thinking about that, have you noticed that companies from Europe, they kind of bring, they probably bring over strategies and commonly as common assumptions about expansion in Europe into the US. Have you seen that typically works, or do they generally need to kind of pivot for the firm to succeed in the US? And if you can speak to any specific example of that from your experience.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things, regardless of any geographic expansion that a company is doing, right? They always need to think through the specifics of the geography. And specific to the US, one of the interesting things is, there really is a speed of the competition here in the US. US incumbents are really aggressive when they recognize that there's a startup that's, built a niche market. They really do respond quickly. And so startups really need to get sharp on positioning quickly. And the second thing is that the sales process in the US has, I believe, more complexity than in other markets in the world. Specifically, the sales process in the US is often very much committee based, right? I've dealt with companies in Europe, and I'll use a med tech for an example. They were able to go into a hospital environment, pitch their technology to a doctor that could make a decision on the product himself. And in the US, there are decision makers, but there are also technical buyers and influencers. And the process is much more challenging because each of those groups of people have a very unique need in the sales process. What the technical buyer values is different than possibly what the decision maker themselves is valuing, but there needs to be a committee thumbs up. And so that is very different oftentimes for a lot of companies that are entering the US market because they're used to a very straight lined decision process. And that's one of the things that I think they come to understand in the journey and have to adapt to.
And that's most likely in the enterprise side, right? When they're doing large B2B sales, where they have to encounter the decision-making unit, where, as you mentioned, there are so many different players with so many different their own priorities and incentives in that. So, what are some? Have you found there are have you found that if there are any other invisible barriers that global founders kind of routinely underestimate beyond the complexity and the distinctiveness of the sales cycle when they're entering here?
Yeah, one of the things that I would say, there is a cultural gap that companies take a little bit of time in understanding. This is one of the things that we try to coach pretty quickly. But Americans value storytelling and confidence in the sales process. A lot of other countries value feature functions, a lot of technical detail. US buyers want to know why you as the company, and why now, right? In very much a storytelling sales process. And so, oftentimes we find that Europeans and even, Asian founders will be very humble, and they will talk about, what is expected, and, with some time and many more customers, we will know. And the American buyer really wants some confidence and a story. And that's how, we often have to coach these founders and salespeople to really engage more directly with the US buyer. So that's a cultural gap there for
So
sure.
how do you support them through that? I think confidence is, it can be learned, but it's hard if you're kind of hardwired and you're coming from the other side of the world where you have to, humility is oftentimes expected when you're starting out, when you're new, when you don't have all the answers, right? And so how do you kind of help them in executing a different early customer discovery and GTM strategy, which helps them find and lean into that confidence?
One of the best ways to do it is really to begin engagement with a US audience as early as possible and in as friendly of an environment as possible. So one of the things that we do specifically is, when we work with customers, with our customers to enter the US market, we start with the discovery interviews to really pressure test their hypotheses directly with a US audience, right? We can do this with some subject matter experts, but we also love to do this, and we do this more often with prospective customers within their ideal customer profile. And this is really about asking questions. This isn't about pitching your product, right? This is asking the questions that led you to developing the product, the problem that you expect to solve. Do they have the same problem? Do they internalize your value proposition in the way that it's internalized in your local geography, right? What kind of messaging resonates? Of the features and functions of your product, how do they rate them, right? And oftentimes you'll find that there are unique differences culturally. I'll use an example. We were working with an AI company from Europe. They were a fintech AI company, and compliance was one of their strongest product features. And in Europe, they led with compliance in every conversation that they had. And when we started talking to their US buying audience, we very quickly found that compliance added a layer of complexity to the sales process that the buyers of the product did not want to engage in. So when you said compliance, they almost turned off. They didn't want to get the compliance people involved because it would add a lot. So while you check the box on compliance in the US, that's not how you led with the messaging. That's not how you led with the value proposition. And it was a pivotal shift for them. And to really hear that from the horse's mouth, so to speak, was the aha moment, right? And those are the types of things we try to do to build, some of this confidence so that when these founders engage in the sales process, they're speaking from experience because they've spoken to potential customers, they've heard the problems, they understand how their solution really addresses the localized issues in the US, or insert whatever geography you're going to, because the model works the same anywhere. And that's really how we look to bolster that confidence through repetitive engagement with a customer.
So, like you mentioned, Matt, it sounds like it really is, it's almost like you are creating a new company because you have a new go-to-market strategy, messaging, value prop, new set of customers, everything. So, how do you do global founders understand the need to balance um, the need to balance action and bias towards action to act fast, especially in early stage scaling, but with the rigor that enterprise customers might want. So, a is there a bit of a battle between you need to know everything about what you're trying to sell versus like you need to act fast? How do they respond to that? Is that significantly different in their where they kind of have, and obviously not that all geographies are the same, but from what you find from companies that are looking to expand into the US, the world, the ones you've worked with, do you find that there's a bit of a cognitive battle for them, for founders in that position?
I think the cognitive battle is almost ubiquitous to the startup category more than anything else, right? Startups are sort of bred to move quickly, right? Build and break and adapt, right? And so when you move into a new market, your desire is to move as quickly as you can. And I think the hard part is letting them know that there's this need to step back, to be methodical, to take a little bit of time to understand, because at the end of the day, that time and that rigor that you'll leverage in your expansion efforts will pay back in expedited time to market, right? But in the beginning, it just feels wrong to every founder that comes in. They want to hire the one salesperson that's going to change everything, right? That's going to build the market. They want to just go out and find customers and without taking the time to realize what works, what doesn't, how it's internalized, how it's perceived, right? What is your competitive set? Is there any issues in, price elasticity? These are things that, a lot of founders understand conceptually, but really do have a hard time, internalizing when you talk about geographic expansion. They just want to go, go, go. And so that becomes a lot of the mentoring and coaching challenge when we're engaging with our customers.
So tell us, let's get a little practical now. I know that USA Launching Pad runs or ran a hybrid accelerator this year at TechCrunch. Tell us a little bit more about that, and then kind of what key inflection points do startups experience in that occupational immersion, and what mistakes have you commonly seen during that phase?
Yeah, great question. So, one of the things that we see, especially in, when they're here for the immersion part of the program, right? This 2 weeks and engaged in an event like TechCrunch, the startups quickly realize that every conversation is a pitch. The questions that come from investors or partners and even journalists when you're there, right? Force founders to really sharpen their clarity. And you see this happen, right? And there are, again, these aha moments where, a friendly, what they, starts out as a friendly meet and greet, gets deeper into those questions of why you, why now, right? And you don't have a lot of time. You really have to get to the point quickly. Again, back to this confidence. And so, that matched with the inflection point that we have in hearing directly from US customers, which we spoke about, right? That's when you see assumptions crash into reality, so to speak, right? And that's when, you really, these learnings are internalized, and then you see them in action, right? You see the responses from these companies becoming much sharper, much more focused, and really, answering the questions that come from the audience that they're participating with in a way that conveys the believability of their solution, right? And that's really great. One of the common mistakes that a lot of the companies make in these events is I'm going to say over networking, right? They really, it's almost, back in the day when business cards were a thing more now than just, getting someone's LinkedIn, but it's this chasing business cards. I'm gonna meet as many people as I can, and I'm gonna get as many business cards as I can. And really what we try to stress is, you need to try to build a meaningful conversation. So, it would be better to have 20 conversations where when you follow up, the person remembers you, as opposed to 100 conversations where there's, a vague recollection. So we really do, try to, again, slow down the pace, because there's always this need or this desire to go, go, go. Um, and the other item that we try to focus our founders on is really about trying to be specific in your pitch, being crisp on, 1 to 2 value propositions. There's, again, many times this desire to try to be everything to everyone at this event. Like, broaden it, because you really don't have the insights that you normally would in an engaged sales process, right? You don't really know what their pain point is. You don't know how they're internalizing your solution. So the default is to try to be broad, right? To try to really just try to make sure that whatever you say, you're going to hit one of their issues. And what we really try to do is try to really have them focus. You can be 1 to 2, things, and that's it. Again, a hard thing for many founders because it feels like you're leaving opportunity on the table. But really, what it does is it positions you for success more than it does um, for failure.
It's a very different perspective on what it takes to scale. It's almost like a very measured, tempered process, right? Like uh, take small actions, get the results, and then kind of build from there. So it's a very it's very refreshing, your perspective, Matt. So I'm really enjoying our conversation. Um,
Thank
when you kind of think about other ecosystem builders who are considering adding a US expansion layer to their programming, um, it sounds like USA Launching Pad is very tailored. It's very focused on what the founder needs specifically. How would you advise them to structure their program so that founders don't fall into the trap of a one size fits all program, or a high, like low touch high scale kind of effort, as we know how complex it is to come into and launch in a new geography.
Yeah, I think one of the lessons that we learned pretty quickly is um, there's a vertical specificity matters. The journey of a fintech founder is different than that of a medtech founder and of an AI SaaS founder. And the go-to-markets are different. And so when you're building some of these programs, I think that vertical specificity matters. And that's one of the first things. I mean, early on, we were very opportunistic and, opportunities came to us and there were interesting conversations to be had generally between founders because they're all managing, sort of the same problems of growth, right? But when it came to really, understanding or collaborating on business specific issues, that's when we saw a little bit of a breakdown. And that's where I would say for some of these ecosystem builders, that vertical specificity, if you're going to build a cohort, try to do it in a vertically focused manner because cohort learning is powerful. It really is. We can do everything as providers, right? But having like-minded founders in the room who are dealing with the issues that you're dealing with in the industry that you're in really does add such a level of value for the individual founders in the cohort. That's what I would say is one of the directions I would suggest companies go to when they build a program for the US.
So, why don't you tell us more about your programs at USA Launching Pad? How does a founder apply? Is there an application process? Is it by invitation only? Do you operate in all geographies outside of the US?
Yeah, so we have built what I call a solutions continuum that aligns to specific maturity levels of a startup. And so we have four programs that we run. Um, the first being what we call market access, and we work with government partners and corporate development arms to really expose some of these early stage companies to the US market. I'll term this technical tourism, right? This is, 3 days to 14 days. If for a tech or an AI company, it would be in Silicon Valley. For a med tech, it would be in Boston. For a fintech, it would be in New York, right? And you bring them in and, expose them to the investment communities, develop a pitch day, bring them to innovation partners so that they can really get a feel for the geography. And as companies mature, right, then we move into what we call our market discovery module. Market discovery is about evaluating the opportunity specifically for you in the US market, right? What is the competitive landscape? What's the price elasticity for the solutions that you have today? What is the go-to-market strategy and the industrial concentration and where all of this very sort of heady research-driven information that enables you to then determine where a US expansion fits in your broader go-to-market, right? Companies have a lot of options when it comes to where they go next. While the US does represent the largest technical buying market in the world, it's also very, competitively heavy. There's a high cost. These are things that all companies should understand before they jump right in. And our discovery module does that, ending with what we call the mastermind roundtable, which brings not only the company founders, but subject matter experts and potential buyers into a roundtable to discuss a lot of these subjects that I just touched on. As you get a little more mature and you're ready to move into the US market, we have a market activation module that is specifically about pressure testing your hypotheses with real customers, doing this through these discovery interviews that I talked about earlier, right? And really now ensuring that all of the messaging, the collateral, your approach to the US market is validated and actionable as we build your pipeline. And then for more mature companies that do have some customers already in the US but are looking to scale, we have a market penetration module, which is really about focused on sales and scaling, right? So we've built this solution continuum to really address the maturity of different companies. Most of our programs are aligned in a cohort setting to one of these events in the US. So TechCrunch, for instance, we talked about earlier. We have, FinTech Week, which I think has now changed their name, in New York, et cetera. So we do some scouting, right? We do our own scouting to look for companies that we think would be, good fits for the cohort. But there is an application process, and it is by invite generally. But we also do have global partners. And so USA Launchpad, we have partners in the MENA region, our partners based in Lagos. We have partners in Greece, in Singapore, in the UK, in France. So we work directly with these partners, they are regional partners, to develop cohorts and even talk to individual companies that they identify that can be good fits. So there are multiple ways to work with us. Not to get too consuming or confusing, I should say. But that's generally the model we use. And again, vertically focused, right? So, if we have a cohort that's coming into New York FinTech Week, it will be with one of our FinTech partners, and we will have a FinTech cohort.
So moving on to ecosystem collaboration, your continuum of support for startups is very, very clear. But you also mentioned that there's a lot of partnerships that enable you to do the work and support the founders and entrepreneurs once they do want to come and expand into the US. How do you wish other, startup support organizations around the world would better understand about collaborating with an organization like a USA launching pad to better support global startups?
Yeah, great question. For us, it's really, I think about execution and really about seeing us as an execution partner, right? Expanding upon the great things that a lot of these ecosystem partners already do. They excel at training, at connections, at even scouting, right? They know their local markets very well and they're really reputable in those markets. We give them the opportunity to expand their portfolio, to include the regional expansion capabilities for the US. Again, a very attractive market for them. And really leveraging our execution capabilities, and those other, fundamental great things that they do, that can just expand not only, their revenue at the end of the day, but also, the capabilities that they're able to provide the companies that they work with. So expanding that life cycle engagement that they have with their companies through USA Launching Pad, is how I like to position us as a partner in the ecosystem.
And so, how could they better work with your methodology to accelerate their founders, whether it's across their incubators, VCs, government bodies? What are things that they should be thinking of so that companies and startups would feed more seamlessly into your continuum of support?
Yeah, for me, it's really about understanding the structural nature, that methodology that we have, right? And that it really does de-risk their portfolio's expansion efforts immensely, right? And so, a lot of these accelerators and government agencies, they spend a lot of money supporting the organizations that they have. And at the end of the day, I think, successful growth of those companies that then generally lead to economic value at home, right? More jobs, more roles in their home market is what they're looking for. And, expansion into the US is one of the prime ways that they can do that. It's a big market with a ton of opportunity. So if you get that right, then you're actually doing, you're executing on your own mission. Eh, you know, whether you're a VC, for quicker exit strategies, and or a government that's looking at economic value, right? So that's how we try to have these conversations with our partners, in internalizing what we do and how that really enhances their overall objectives when it comes to helping their companies.
So, playing devil's advocate here for a second, what if they get it wrong? Have you been in a position where startups have tried to expand to the US and they're just not a good fit? Like, what are some red flags that might um, be indicative of the fact that this company or this service might not be, the US may not be the best place for them to land and expand? I mean, the world is much bigger than the US. So how do you have you been in that position, and how do you navigate if you get into that space?
Yeah. It's a hard message to give, but the great thing about our program is it's really so data backed that it's hard to challenge. And we have come up with this several times. I would say, I haven't updated these numbers in several months, but it was close, a little under 10% of the companies we engage with, um, we find the US market is not the right fit for them, whether it be from a timing perspective or a product perspective. Um, we were working with one company, for example. They revolutionized. This is going to sound a little corny, but locker room systems, globally. And so, in Europe, logistics facilities and hospitals, if you can minimize the footprint of a locker room, right, you can then use that extra space for revenue producing functions, right? So it's the ROI is straightforward and simple. Locker rooms haven't been touched in years and years and years, and they're getting great traction in Europe. When we came to the US and started to do evaluation of the US market, what we found really quickly was a couple things. Um, in hospitals specifically, there were no consolidated locker room spaces. So there were multiple locker rooms, but now all of a sudden your ROI is fragmented. You get a few feet here and a few feet there. And so it's harder to then build a new operating room out of the extra space in a locker. We also found, after doing these interviews, that most of the staff in US hospitals don't change at the hospital. They change at home. The nurses, the techs, they come in their scrubs, they bring a bag, they come home. So the utilization of the locker room is much lower, right? And so there wasn't as much of an ROI in the same way as Europe. And then the final kind of nail in the coffin was the facilities themselves didn't address locker rooms except for during the build phase of a hospital, And with that, they relied on their architects. So now we all of a sudden found that there was a 5-year sales cycle.
Mm.
Right? And so now, to your point, Saba, the world is a very large place. You find out that the US, while it's a big market, might not be the best place to focus your efforts right now, right? You
Yeah.
can start building those relationships with the architects because they're very specific. Architects who build hospitals and hospital wings, or it's not a huge market, but you start to build those relationships, and there are things you can do. But going full bore into the U.S. was not the right answer, right? And while that's hard, right, for any founder, because that's what they want, the data was there to make it, reasonable and rational. And that's just one example. This has happened with SaaS companies and, different tech companies, climate tech companies, for instance. We've gotten a couple of these where it just wasn't the right time. Geopolitical stuff aside, which is, changing climate tech a little bit in the US, but it just, there wasn't a market for the cool stuff that they did. There was just no ROI
Mm.
attached to it that made it a must-have. When things are nice to have, right? It's hard to build a sales pipeline on a nice to have. You have to get to that must have, and that's one of the things we focus on in the program. And because it's all data backed and customer centric, right? You're hearing all this directly from the customers, and so it's hard to argue. And at the end of the day, after the bitter pill is swallowed, these founders are grateful because the effort that they put into finding this out and the money that they spent to do it is so much less than it would have been in trial and error in trying to enter the US and hiring salespeople and not really understanding the market before you get here.
Yeah, and then it's always better to get to a quick no than like a long drawn out maybe, which eventually might turn into a no, and then you have a zombie startup on your hand, right? Because like now you've built this company and you got a few yeses, but there's no real, like you said, must have solve a problem that you're trying to solve. So
Well said. Yeah, I mean, and that is it, right? This to get to a quick no is really, really valuable. Doesn't happen often, but
yeah.
it does happen.
So let's switch gears and I can look to the future. And obviously, we can't talk about the future without talking about AI. So, given the rise of AI, B2B SaaS, AI SaaS, digital health, new remote delivery models, how do you, from your perspective, how are these shifts reshaping what success looks like for US market entry? Or are they? Have things changed?
Yeah, it's obviously changing things and changing things by the day, right? AI, the pace at which AI capabilities are being launched is really unprecedented. But AI at the end of the day, AI and even SaaS, they lower barriers to entry. Leaner teams can deliver globally without physical presence. So that's where I think a lot of the benefit from AI is coming, and I think that makes the US even a more attractive market, right? Digital health is challenging in regulatory, right? In every geography that I have either worked within and or we help, the US market, there is local validation that needs to be made, right? HIPAA, payer systems that, there's a lot of hurdles to the US market that you need to understand intimately to make sure that your product can be uh, not only utilized, but actually executed in the States, right? But, again, back to AI, it really does, allow companies to sort of land first, have some, pilot opportunities with a smaller US team before committing heavily into US by having a ton of resources, right? Because you can really execute globally, which I think is great.
So, thinking about providing advice to founders, or even the folks that support expansion programs into the US. If you had a magic wand and you could eliminate a structural one kind of paramount structural inefficiency or cultural blind spot in how global startups approach US expansion, what would it be and why?
Yeah, I would say, overconfidence in copy paste strategies, right? A lot of companies really do believe I've got this, right? We know we've got such a great product, we've got all this feature functionality. It will work. It solves a problem, right? I don't need to necessarily take a step back,
Mhm.
right? And really, eliminating that blind spot early, I believe saves millions of wasted dollars of go-to-market spend. I mean, if you can, take a minute, understand the nuances of the market, right? Develop a regional landing plan, right? That really does enable you um, to allocate your resources well, right? That would really be, the paramount thing because it happens way too often. And interestingly enough, more often than not, it happens with with English speaking foreign countries, right? We get it, we speak the language, right? There's not that much cultural difference. I understand English, right? Um, and that's funny to me because, if you look at the data, some of those English speaking countries have had the fewest scaled tech, med tech, climate tech companies globally. And a lot of that, I think, is this copy paste mentality.
You see that copy paste mentality a lot in reverse as well, right? Where you have regions that are just trying to recreate Silicon Valley and Wadis and all kinds of things, right? But without really thinking about what is it that made Silicon Valley unique in the first place. So your advice of leaning into what makes you unique and then figuring out how you can leverage that, bring that to the US, I think is really, really fantastic advice for global founders. So let's switch to the ecosystem builders, right? Folks in your position. What advice would you give them to as they're designing support systems and programs to meaningfully de-risk global expansion for founders?
A few things that I would say. First is, I would talk about, designing a layered support system. I talked about not only, specific programs for specific maturity levels, but also, ensuring that there's validation components in each, right? And stages and gates that give founders and companies enough data to make decisions about next steps, right? As an important base component to the program, right? That decision-making data should be key to the development of the program. Um, I think investing in customer voice early is paramount, right? Subject matter experts are great. We use them, right? And they're an integral part of what we do. Um, but they are not the customer. They have been in the industry, they know the customer, they know the space, but really engaging with the customer, and bringing that customer voice into your discovery efforts, whatever that is, right? Whatever stage you're in, but that customer voice is key. Even in I talked about the later stage programs of penetration, right? This is when you get back to customer roundtables and saying, why did you choose us, and what can we improve, and what value, right? Just constantly including the customer voice, I think, is a really, really key component. Um, and then finally, there is an ecosystem, to your point, right? So building bridges between, orgs, between government export agency and accelerators and VCs, right? And end, right? An ecosystem is just that, right? And so, one of the things that we try to do at USA Launching Pad is, outside of what we do directly, we have built, a partner ecosystem to give companies access to the, tools and resources that they might need to smooth the road to regional expansion, right? And so, I recommend building those bridges because there are a lot of areas where you might necessarily not have the direct expertise, but there are people that do, and they're more than willing to give, some advice and do a workshop and, help out, the early stage companies in at least understanding what some of the complexities or challenges are within a specific subject matter, and then going from there.
Well, thanks so much, Matt. We're at the end of our time here with you. Really enjoyed our conversation today. I think there's so much to learn, not just for global founders, but even local founders who just kind of bringing back the customer voice at the center of everything you do. I think our innovation ecosystem builder partners have, would if they would probably love to engage with you. Thank you so much for your time and really appreciated all your insights today.
It was a pleasure, Saba. Thanks so much. You have a great rest of your day.
You too. Thank you.